I often get this statement said to me that there is no property rights without the government, which is kind of a silly thing to say considering the government so routinely violates individual body and property rights with things like conscription and taxation and whatnot. But we just have to get to the root here of what property rights are. And property rights are just a human psychology. When you think about property rights, it's this idea that some people are perceiving what you have in your body as independent of them and not theirs to touch or infringe upon. So when it comes to this idea of property rights, you're just dealing with respect as among other people. You don't deal with that when it comes to animals and things like that, because animals can't meaningfully respect property rights. You can't expect a bird to not poop on your car or a squirrel to not climb up on your roof. It's about people dealing with other people. If you were the last person on Earth, you wouldn't have to worry about property rights as to other people because there'd be no other human being to come and infringe upon your property rights. So really, it is just these ideas that people hold in their heads about each other, and they say to themselves, okay, I'm not going to physically intrude upon or take from another person's property. I'm not going to touch their house, their body, their car, this or that without their permission. That's what property rights are. They're just a psychology. And so whether or not those psychologies are being respected or disrespected is cultural. You have to have enough people who are willing to abide by those norms to simply have a kind of general status of not having your property infringed upon, right? If you had your neighbors all like a bunch of animals, like they're a bunch of zombies or something like that, and they acted in a way that was typical of other creatures. They just pooped on your car, they climbed your house, like a squirrel or raccoon or whatever. You wouldn't be able to maintain anything because every person who's your neighbor, on average would be just crossing your property, just like tons of creatures do, like lizards or snakes or frogs or whatever. So in order for property rights to have meaningful effect, you need to have that cultural respect, and people need to be willing to do that, to say, okay, I'm not going to mess with your property. And some people say, well, they only do that in response to threats of force with the government. And it's like, well, maybe some do, but that's not the core truth of the matter. You just need the psychological respect of other people's property in order for that to be a truth of being maintained. You just need the ideas. And governments themselves are violative of individual body and property rights, obviously, because taxation is forcible takings by the government against people, whether or not they agree to it or any particular thing that's done with it. The property taxes you have are perpetual. They go on and on and on forever. You never can really own your home. The government says they can take your body and force you into labor with conscription. So it's just this absurdity that government is this bastion of where property rights spring from, or that you couldn't have any property rights without it, because you could have property rights simply by people respecting those property rights, and you could stop those who would infringe upon it yourself physically or with private defense. Whether it's a police officer who stops someone breaking into your home, or yourself, that you shoot an intruder and stop them from breaking your home, the intruder gets stopped, right? So fundamentally, when people are talking about, this property rights maintenance, they're just saying, okay, well, what's done to stop property rights violations? And that is people using force if necessary to stop someone or to remove someone who is trespassing. And that's done in a host of ways. Could be by government, could be by private individuals, but it just has to happen. So it doesn't matter whether the government aspect is there or not, right? The government could be actually even worse than anything imagined, right? If you have a really tyrannical government and the government intentionally takes people's resources and plunders them and forces them into labor camps, or has mass murder campaigns, as many governments have throughout the 20th century. Having government doesn't really secure your property rights then if they're really directly using violence against people, in addition to the norms of governments taking people's money by force through taxation and other things. So in reality, property rights are just a human psychology, and it's a dial between whether or not it's being respected or disrespected. And governments fall on that dial themselves, whether they're closer to respecting property rights or further away. And as a voluntarist, as a libertarian, I want that dial turned maximally toward respecting consent and property rights. And with that means that the government has to move toward voluntary means of funding. It means it can't have victimless crime laws, throwing people in cages for things that don't involve in infringing on people's physical or bodily property rights, doing harm and things like that. So ultimately, if we want to have property rights, we just need a cultural change. We just need people to act on them by and large. And those who don't, just simply to have consequences or means to restitution or means to justice in the event that someone is harmed. And those things can come through many different ways. Government as a construct obviously could do those things, but it always does so by first violating property rights, and in many cases, being the chief property rights violating entity among all things. So it's kind of silly to think the government there is the root of property rights when really they are the disrespect of property rights at its very inception. They just may help facilitate certain types of systematized theft in a way that keeps things somewhat routine for people to think about, and that kind of thing. But no, if we want a free future, we need a cultural change for property rights respect through and through. And that means people generally adopting these ideas. That means people in government adopting these ideas, and the violence of the state going down on that dial, heading towards zero.